Hello, everyone. This is your host, Manoj Tandon. Welcome to another episode of Dark Rhiino Security Confidential. We have another awesome guest today. Before I tell you about him, please hit the like and subscribe button. We live in a world of algorithms, and we need to see a little love so we can keep bringing you this content. But without further ado, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our next guest here today. He is been in the industry for 2 decades. He has over 20 years of experience. Bob Burke, he is the Chief Information Security Officer at Beyond Identity, and he's helping build out the company's identity first access management platform. We're going to talk to him a little bit about that today. And, you know, he has spent a lot of time in engineering leadership. He brings a lot of experience and deep expertise in identity, cloud infrastructure, compliance, protecting mission critical SaaS applications, if you will. So without further delay, Bob, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate you being on the show.
My pleasure.
So, you know, we always like to start off with, give us a little bit of your background. How did you get into the cybersecurity game? Is that what you always wanted to be when you grew up, or?
No. Like everybody of my generation, probably wanted to be an astronaut, right? That's how we all started, or a firefighter, or one of those, right? But like most security professionals, which I think in the end we'll talk a little bit about why I think security is such an interesting role, because it's the blending of a lot of things. But like a lot of security professionals, my background is a bit, it's not linear. It's a bit eclectic. So what I graduated with the degrees in aerospace engineering and computational fluid dynamics, which seems like a strange start.
It's not, because your host here did a very similar thing.
Oh, well, see, there you go. I think, you know, it's kind of funny because I think data scientists and security personnel have the most eclectic backgrounds in general. But there's a reason for that. And we'll get into that later, hopefully. But I started with aerospace engineering and I got into grid computing. So I went from the mathematic computational side to the software side very quickly. That was where my passion was, in software. And then very early on in my career, I worked at a company called NetRake that was really fundamentally building the first session border controllers and security gateways.
Okay.
And that was revolutionizing how telephony worked at the time. This was the early 2000s, still the .com era.
Yep.
And we were doing deep packet inspection. We were doing network engineering. We were doing early embedded development, writing new changes to kernels that needed to have different types of network capabilities. So it was a really exciting time. And that's when I was first introduced to network engineering and network security, which was really, really fun and really interesting. And I met some of the most brilliant people I've ever worked with. I met at that time in my career, and it really shaped what I wanted to do. And then shortly after that, I took some of that knowledge and I decided to work for a telco and try to push that technology out into the ecosystem. Did that for a few years, which was a lot of fun. And then I got the startup bug. This is where it all started. I wanted to do another startup on my own. And my partner calls it a character flaw because I'm drawn to startups. But it's just the passion for building things. And one of the first startups I looked at was doing early authentication and access management for banking.
Okay.
And this is back in 2007. This is well before FIDO was a thing or U2F was a thing. And it was even predated about a year and a half or about a year, the iPhone. And so what we were trying to do is we were working with banks to try to build an authentication and authorization layer that used multi-factor cards that would tunnel into the home, where you could tap a device in the house and not share any of your banking information and do kind of all your multi-factor authentication. So it used IPsec, EPKA, and all that stuff. And I think it was probably a little bit ahead of its time.
Okay.
Because although we proved the technology, adoption was a problem.
Sure. It wasn't part of the cultural fabric yet.
No, and I can remember people telling us no one in their right mind is ever going to tap a device to log into anything.
Well, they haven't walked into a hospital recently, have they?
No. And so I thought that was interesting, like the consumer, and that's all we do, and we authenticate, and we'll get into all the problems with that. with what the Beyond Identity addresses. So that kind of got me into that. And then shortly after that, I went and worked at a with a VC firm to help bootstrap energy startups. Worked across a number of different startups, and I would come in and kind of just build the engineering team, get the technology set up, and then get them off to the races. And that was one of the ones that was near and dear to my heart. Is we did energy management. We'd go to companies and reduce their energy spend by 8 or 10%, and that could save them millions.
Yeah, that's a big number.
Yep. And so what that got me into was IoT, where it's all going to lead to Beyond Identity. And the first thing with IoT devices on-prem is device attestation, device security, mutual authentication. So that's where I started getting into this idea that the device was part of the ecosystem and the device had to have a strong identity. I think sometimes people forget that. User has an identity, the device has an identity. And we'll see that that's core to Beyond Identity's technology. So I got into that piece, and then I'll kind of run this along a little bit. And then I worked at a company, and we did we deployed, like early on, I deployed one of the first session border controllers at this new company in 2017. I participated on the W3C verifiable credentials. Okay. Heady days when people are talking about sovereign identity and distributed identifiers and verifiable credentials. One of the first industry-wide implementations of verifiable credentials was through a company called Coupon Media. And what we did is we provided age-restricted offers in the convenience store space across 50,000 stores. And we would use verifiable credentials early on so that they could actually purchase age-restricted offers. So again, security and identity. So this was, I've got network security, then I've got device security, I've dealt with authentication, and now I'm dealing with identity and identity proofing, because a big part of the verifiable credential was we had to integrate, I won't go into names, but third-party identity proofing solutions so that we could produce a credential.
Sure. So
that was really interesting. And then that led me to eventually Beyond Identity. And through that whole journey, what was really interesting for me was it was clear that security had multiple stages, right? Device, access to secure collaboration. And another passion of mine was I kept asking myself, why is security not part of the original product ideation? Like, it seems like sometimes security is almost considered operational overhead. So that's where I kind of ended up at Beyond Identity.
And that question has a lot of complex answers, but like when you started off in banking, I'm sure maybe that was a mainframe or Unix based systems even back then. I would imagine in 2007 or
2007. They were just rolling out like these big. Everything was in data centers, so they had these big IBM racks that you had to deploy.
Right? So those products were never designed with. Like, security was not a core concept in the building of those.
Nope.
Right? It was transaction throughput, reliability.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting you say that, because one of we had some people from the banking industry on our board, and their big concern at the time, obviously, was security and extension, but was cybersecurity insurance, because really? The cost of the insurance was tied to they would audit the capabilities that they had at the bank and decide based on the capabilities they were deploying what insurance level they had. And just deploying the proper solution at the right time could save them tens of millions of dollars in insurance costs.
Wow. Now,
so that was.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Bob.
No, you go.
Thought. I was going to ask. Back then, was there a concern on nation-state threat actors still getting into, or what was the main threat in the banking ecosystem?
So the main threat was just straight credential theft, right? They wanted to deliver. We really didn't talk about nation actors back then. It was really, and because this solution was somewhat expensive because it was cutting edge, they were targeting their high value customers. And so what they wanted to do is they wanted to ensure they had a strong telepresence in all of the homes of the high value customers. So we had to lay down a strong network backbone, security backbone, and authentication for those customers so they could do remote banking safely.
Okay. Wow, things have changed. I mean, you've seen
Oh,
this industry then evolve
mhm.
in so many ways. Windows and Active Directory, was that a good thing or bad thing, or where do you stand with that? How did that change the landscape?
So uh, it's a good thing because, and this is, and you'll understand this. There's always that tension between productivity tools and a security mindset. Tools that are
Yeah,
built for productivity, well, they're really good at productivity, but oftentimes they open the door to a lot of threats. So Active Directory, obviously from a productivity standpoint, it's the world we live in, and we have to deal with it, and it drives a lot of value in the IT industry. However, it's also, even today, it's a source of a lot of security threats. So basically, individuals who have a legacy AD deployment, they just fundamentally, on how their systems are laid out and how those systems are joined,
yep,
have a lot of native threats. If someone, and we can talk about this, not only getting your credentials, or they use info stealers to drop on the systems, but if you get on those systems, stopping lateral movement in those legacy systems becomes really hard,
yep.
because there's a lot of things, legacy things that were done that haven't been cleaned up yet.
What is your advice to an organization in that position?
Yeah, and it's going to be my advice across the board is, what you're going to see today is there's going to be all kinds of flashy AI stuff and all kinds of other types of attacks that everybody's super excited about defending against, and we need to address those, and we can't talk about those today. But fundamentally, it's all about security architecture. At the end of the day, and this comes from my engineering principles, when you have a large engineering solution, what you need to do is you need to find out what systems or what parts of the system, particularly from a security architecture, you can move from detection and operational control to prevention. So my advice to everybody in those ecosystems is, you really need to take your legacy systems seriously. Don't get distracted by the fancy new stuff. We'll talk about that. But you really have to have an architectural vision that moves systems from detection to prevention. That's
And,
the only way you're going to be able to maintain this changing, or stay sane in this new threat landscape, because it's, go ahead.
and that is probably one of the most difficult roles, if not the most difficult roles, is finding a fantastic security architect
Yes.
that can
Well,
actually understand, because they need to understand the business. They must understand the business. And then they can overlay appropriate controls, whether it's technology or process or otherwise. But they that is the most valuable and probably most difficult role. And I don't see any industry, in our industry, there's really not a certification for that per se that I would say is worth anything.
no. And it's I no, I completely agree. And my advice to any organization is, you need to take your core security architecture seriously, because at the end of the day, that is going to determine your attack surface, your fundamental attack surface. And the
Yes.
architecture is a journey. It's not a point in time. For example, you look at some of the MFA solutions that have rolled out over the last 4 or 5 years. That was super great that people recognize that as an architectural gap, 100%. However, the existing MFA solutions that invariably got rolled out are target a threat landscape that's about 5 years old, because now bypassing MFA is trivial with the new phishing as a service, malware as a service, and now some of the roll on some AI sugar on top of that. And bypassing a legacy MFA that uses, whether it's an authenticator, OTP, SMS, magic link, they're just not sufficient. And so the architecture, you need to take a look at your architecture, and you need to make sure you're staying in, you have a vision that aligns with the threat landscape.
So that's an interesting comment to make, because when I just look at it from a pure industry perspective, the two big dogs, or three, where Ping for legacy systems, Okta for cloud, and
Mm-hmm.
Microsoft, big player in cloud with their Entra applications. What those are not, well, ping's pretty old, but the other two are not that ancient of a technology.
No,
What are the
2000.
gaps that have developed that really cause their MFA effectivity to go down? I'd love to hear it in your.
Yeah. So if they're deploying, I don't want to get into the specific names of the products, but if you're deploying, if they take Tycoon 2FA right now
Okay.
today, that targets its primary target is going to be people logging into Microsoft 365. Not that that's a problem, but that's just a high value target because a lot of
Sure.
people log into it. And the current deployed MFA solutions are using legacy authenticators. They're using SMS, they're using OTP, they're using magic links. Those are fundamentally, as we've seen with FIDO and stuff like that,
Oh, yeah.
those are fundamentally not secure. They can be phished very easily. Now, 3 or 4 years ago, when they rolled out their solutions, um, they had an MFA solution that was better than not having an MFA solution because the cost of attacking that MFA solution was expensive, right? And it often required a very sophisticated threat actor that had to understand infrastructure, had to understand how to stand up a solution, had to understand how to do reconnaissance, attack you, get your information, then sell it on the dark web, right?
Yep.
That is not the case today. Today, for a few $100s, if you're so inclined, you can go get whether it's Tycoon 2FA or Evil Proxy, you can buy that as a service. It's kind of crazy when you think about it, Manoj, because as we've evolved with our capabilities and we've built platforms and libraries and AWS scale and all this other stuff, the threat actors haven't been sitting still. They've built their own ecosystem.
Sure, they have. And they've
And
gotten highly efficient.
yes, no, that's exactly right. I mean, the cost of actually targeting a let me take a step back. It's kind of interesting because I was going to mention this with security architecture. Oftentimes, and you said from a security architect perspective, that's a critical role that we often don't see because they have to understand the business. Well, when you go to your boss and you say, we need to make an investment in phishing resistant MFA or the next thing that you think is appropriate, oftentimes you'll get, well, we haven't had a breach, right?
Oh, yeah.
So
You
we
say
must be safe.
yet is the operative word there. Or you don't
Yeah,
know about the fact that you've been breached.
right. And we don't know about it. Or oftentimes you have to deal with this weird scenario where absence of proof is proof of absence, right?
Yeah.
And it's hard to win that when you're the one asking for money. Um, so it then you have to bring the information and you have to understand the information in the architecture and where the threats really are today. Um, and that's a tough thing to do.
It is, and especially, we see this all the time that everyone that is able to make a decision is typically so disconnected from the world of security that they don't even understand what's being asked for. And then
Yeah.
typically on the cybersecurity side, people don't know how to explain it in terms that the business will understand it, and how it affects things and how it may affect things. But that's an age-old problem. And again, if you have a good security architect that does understand how you make money, they should be able to plug that. Now, there's unfortunately
That's right.
just not that many of them around. That
Yeah, and it's I've struggled with this too, and we've seen a little bit. So I like to think that the CISO role, as you move to larger organizations, maybe it gets more segmented and fragmented onto compliance and infosec and stuff like that. Which I still think we need to change because it needs to be more tightly coupled with the product, because then it becomes a more relevant and strong argument, or at least to the business value, whatever the business value is of the company. But on smaller companies and smaller, say startups, what I've seen is the CISO and or the security perspective has to be part of, and maybe I'm biased because I'm in cybersecurity company itself, but it has to be tied to the product. And if you can't express security in the terms of the value add for the business, then you're always going to be considered an operational expense.
that is a very unique perspective. I think you're the first one to mention that actually in all the guests. It's been alluded to, but it's never been explicitly stated like that.
Yeah.
And I think that's very true.
Yeah. And let's just take compliance, for example. Compliance, when you say compliance, everybody's eyes roll and you talk to an engineer and they're like, who cares, right? You're just building a product. And then you start to realize that, and I've seen since, if I go back to like 2015, I was at a startup and we were doing the digital ledgers and digital offers, and we talked about verifiable credentials. Rarely was asked about my compliance stature, right? It was rare that a company even asked. Maybe they asked me about CCPA because we were doing business in California, but I didn't have to do a SOC audit. They certainly weren't asking for ISO. They didn't ask me about NIST or anything like that. But over the last few years, you've seen an escalation of customers not only asking about your compliance regime, meaning we don't even want you as a partner if you can't prove that you can be a good partner, which means you have to be a secure partner, because everything's interconnected now. Supply chain, software, we're all just, but what you're seeing now is if you're going to deliver a product, you also have to be able to articulate intelligently how you're going to enable their compliance regime. I can't give them a product. Everybody, if you look at the RegTech industry, everybody's got like automated GRC on their roadmap, right? It's just the way it is. So when we sell to a customer, if our product isn't, compliant on day one and has a plan for automated compliance, and we can, whether it's PCI DS 4.0 or whatever, we have to tell them that when you take our product, your compliance regime is going to be augmented. We're not just going to be something else you have to layer compliance onto. So I think it's changing, and people need to kind of get with the program on the security side.
Now, a side question, what's your personal opinion organizationally with the CISO role that's typically a part of the IT organization? I've always thought that's a conflict of interest. The CISO role should really be outside the confines of IT.
I tend to agree with you on that, but the practical reality, I can tell you right now that even at Beyond Identity, I'm running the IT group, right? I mean, it rolls up to me, and I think that's because the organization doesn't know how to distinguish the two. It doesn't know where to put IT once you pull that out. But no, I think that's right. I think in larger organizations, the CISO has to be an independent actor. It has to have a strong security. It goes back to the security architect, but it's also beyond that. It's just the CISO has to have a strong vision about how the security enables the business.
You've, Bob, talked about, I believe or use the term an MFA apocalypse. Can you explain what that is exactly? Sure. What are you referring to?
Yeah, and that's our marketing team coined that, the MFA apocalypse, which is great. But fundamentally, I think what I'm saying is, and this goes back to absence of proof is proof of absence, kind of is not proof of absence. I think we've gotten kind of lax on how our MFA solutions. We think we've solved the MFA problem when we deployed our first generation of MFA solutions. And at the time we did a little bit because it made it more difficult for the actors of the day to bypass our solution. So it's better than not having it. Username, password can be breached easily. Now you have a second device and it's more complicated. But I guess what we're saying is the landscape has changed, right? And it's not okay now to just have an MFA solution. It's got to be phishing resistant. And NIST clearly defines what those requirements are. And the reason I think that we're going to see more and more breaches is when someone, and it goes back to absence of evidence, just because you haven't seen an attack doesn't mean your security program is sufficient. It just means you haven't been noticed yet. And the reason you haven't been noticed yet is the cost benefit analysis of the attackers was such that they went after the high value targets. And the high value targets have always had the most sophisticated solutions. But right now, because of the industrialization, right? We just talked about that. The phishing is malware as a service, phishing as a service, and the sophistication of the attacks. For a few $100s, I can attack hundreds of companies with man in the middle attacks or the attack in the middle, right? And it costs me nothing. And now, if you layer on AI, bypassing traditional MFA is trivial. And the reason, and we're starting to see that the evidence is clear with some of the most recent reports that we're seeing more and more credential theft through phishing attacks because, quite simply, the scale of the attacks has increased.
So, and I can readily see it if you are using links or you're still asking who was your great grandmother or what city you were born in, or
Yep.
doing those to me are trivial to defeat
Yep.
anymore. That's not a hard thing to defeat. But if you're using like an authenticator, a
hmm
time-based, time-coded authenticator, do you think that's still?
Yeah. Yep. If you have to share a secret, doesn't matter if it's time based. If it's out of band, and you take some whatever code, I have an authenticator that I have to use on different solutions, and you take that and you enter that. That's a shared secret. That's it's trivial to intercept that. I mean, you can take the scenario where I receive. Let's say I'm just Bob. I'm a customer support person. I'm just sitting around doing whatever I'm doing, and I'm servicing my customers, right?
Okay.
All I do is I get, let's say I'm pressured to get a bunch of stuff done. I'm working on whatever I'm working on today. Maybe I'm working on 6 different customers. Maybe I've posted on LinkedIn that I was at 3 different conferences and all these wonderful things. I can get a well-crafted email that tells me to click on a link, right? And with today's AI technology, that link and or that email that may come along with it is completely tied to a context that's relevant to me. I can click on that link, and this is all legacy stuff. Once I go to that proxy, and it takes me to that proxy, which is completely designed to look exactly like, Office 365 or whatever
Sure.
I think I'm logging into. Once I have that, if you don't have, and we'll get into what makes something phishing resistant, they pretty much have me, because all they now need to do is convince me to interact with that system and do a reverse proxy and talk to the system I'm trying to get to, and they get the trusted system to send you the authentication, whether it's a notification in your authenticator, whether it's a push notification, whether it's an SMS text or whatever it is, and then you're going to stick that back into the system, and they're done. They now have your authentication and do whatever they want. So if it's OTP, whether it's SMS, TOTP, OTP, authenticator, push notification, magic link is a little bit harder, but you still can do that. Those are all fundamentally flawed and today very easily phishable.
Well, then a question on top of that, then, if I may, why has what one flaw that I've seen nobody address is that with all these authenticators, it all seems to be, they're assuming this device, right?
Yep.
Now, why is the IMEI number, which doesn't change, which is a static number on this,
Mm-hmm.
not used to verify the actual device that
Yeah.
authentication is coming from?
Okay. So I can give you 2 answers to that.
Please.
We used to do that back in the early aughts when we were doing UMA. So basically, when we were building security gateways and for telco companies, we would identify the device with that identifying piece of information. That's how we used to do it. Today, companies like Apple won't let you do that because they don't want you to uniquely identify the device. So what you need to do is you need to lay down your own credential on top of it in the secure element that's part of your application to do that. Because if you could uniquely identify the device from the device perspective, then that would violate the trust models that a lot of the device vendors or the mobile phone vendors have with their customers.
I can see that. I mean, that's a double-edged sword,
Mm-hmm.
but it could also, again, these things were not designed with security in mind, so I can see some issues there, but it could have been the data was, shall we say, redacted to where it's not showing behavioral patterns on the device. But that would be one way. But now I understand what you're saying, that you have to now put your own unique.
That's right.
So I want to get into that more a little bit, but before we do, you've mentioned phishing resistant attacks. Can you
Mm-hmm.
explain a little bit more about what NIST says about
Yeah,
what's a phishing resistant mechanism, or MFA.
right. So fundamentally, if anybody's familiar here with the NIST 63, NIST 863 A, B, and C, they talk about federated access levels, identity access levels, and then authentication. Assurance. So federation assurance levels. So FAL, IAL, which is identity assurance levels, and then they have something also called AAL, which is authentication assurance levels. And they go through 1, 2, and 3. Won't go all the details. I'll just talk more about what it means to be phishing resistant, and they're very specific about what it means to be phishing resistant. And fundamentally, for a system to be phishing resistant, it has to start with binding the origin server to the authenticator and a piece of keying material that is specific to that to that to that origin server or domain, or quite simply, the destination you're going to authenticate has to be cryptographically bound to some piece of information on the authenticator that's stored in a secure element. That's fundamentally at the core of what needs to happen.
Okay.
And if you look at FIDO or any other solution, once you do that, it becomes what I call phishing resistant. It becomes very difficult for someone to intercept that authentication. Close to impossible, but nothing's impossible. It's very difficult when you authenticate. So that's at the core of what that is, and it's called the goal is called verifier impersonation resistance, which means, quite frankly, and will Beyond Identity has solutions that attack deep fakes, and it's kind of the same problem statement. But it's like Manoj is talking to Bob. Manoj is talking to Bob. You need to know that you're talking to the real Bob.
Yes.
Right? And the only way to do that is through a registration process that binds the device and the keying material to Bob or to the bob.com, so that when there's an exchange of authentication, the authenticator can verify that it's talking to the real Bob. And when you look at all the and this is where I go back to, there are some big players in the space, and they're all great companies, right? We've hired people from them. People have left our company, gone to them. Everybody's in this space trying to add value and deliver value to the customer. We're all great companies, but a lot of those companies are struggling with the fact that they built their systems and the landscape changed around them. And so now they have to add a system that was built to solve a particular problem. They now have to add capabilities to it, which, is doable, but it can be quite complicated. And this is where younger companies have an advantage, right? Because they come in and they can adopt this technology from the ground up.
Absolutely. Which brings us to your company, Beyond Identity. So what do you folks do exactly? Give us a little bit of a...
Sure. So fundamentally, what Beyond Identity, the reason for Beyond Identity to exist is we're an access management solution that's built from the ground up to address the new identity landscape and to eliminate identity threats. And when you start to think about, and we can talk about all the different capabilities, and I'll get into that kind of what we do. But when we look at identity and this new threat space we're in, there's kind of 3 tiers, and we kind of alluded to it a few minutes ago. There's the device, there's the access, and then there's the collaboration. Okay, and those are like if you follow your journey today, when you log into something, you're going to be logging into something from a device.
Yep.
You're going to be going through some kind of access plane, like you get authenticated, then you can hand it off to an access plane.
Yep.
It does a bunch of stuff, maybe applies some policies and all that fancy stuff. Maybe if you're really lucky, it has 0 standing privilege or just-in-time access, right?
Yep.
Then it literally hands you off to the SP or the service, right? Like whether it's Windows, Office 365. So that's your journey. What Beyond Identity is, they see those, Beyond Identity tries to play at each one of those stages, both from the device attestation perspective. We could talk about things like reality check in a minute, through the access, the authentication, then through the access layer, and then eventually to what we call secure collaboration, which again, our first release of something called reality check is kind of targeting that. And so it was built from the ground up with compliance by design, secure by design, secure configuration by design on day one. And it makes it really easy for our customers to basically implement a security architecture that is simpler, consolidated, that moves a whole bunch of identity threats from detection to prevention. Whether that's the initial access, it's obvious from MFA how we affect initial access, because if you can't phish a credential, you've killed the MITRE kill chain, or you've blocked the MITRE kill chain around initial access in so many ways. And then because we have a whole set of desktop login capabilities with our authentication that all come together, for the legacy customers out there that are actually implementing, they have Windows systems, we can eliminate a whole bunch of lateral movement threats on the system when you deploy our current solution with desktop login. And then, I can go into all the other things, but that's kind of the passion for us, as we saw identity. Identity used to be a productivity problem, but it's really a security problem, right? I mean, at the end of the day,
it's very much a security problem.
Yeah.
I'd say. Now, are you doing this? Biometrics, are they a part of this, or
Absolutely.
passwordless?
Yep. No, you can't put I mean, if you took a chisel and a hammer, you couldn't jam a password into our system. There's no way to do it. Basically, at its core, it's phishing resistant, passwordless. And it has device attestation, so we can take a look at the device, the identity of the device. We cryptographically bind it with a user credential when you authenticate. That information gets packed up, because we have an SSO solution, up to the access plane. So now you essentially have a device user-bound verifiable credential that can be passed to all the integrated identity platform providers that we integrate with, so that you can now have a real kind of coherent kind of identity substrate.
So let's talk about the a dark use case here. How, when you're working with biometrics, so you have a high value bank employee that travels through a country that has some interest in compromising that asset for whatever reason.
Yep.
And they pick that person up. How now they have the device, they have the person, and there's no passwords involved, so they can force entry into the system with that identity.
No, they can, but you can also layer on what we can do. If you, in that particular scenario, we have what's called UEBA, which is user entity behavioral analysis. So you layer that on top of this. So if we see something going on that looks suspicious, our policy engine can layer on the need for a second or third device. So dynamically, you can basically adjust what you need, how they're logging in. Now, it's not a great situation for that poor employee. I mean, because he couldn't lose a finger.
No, it's not. But I can see it. Look, if you happen to work for a 3-letter agency and your identity is compromised, or you're law enforcement and you mess somebody up over in the Eastern Bloc, and they know you're on that airplane, well, all bets are off, man.
No, that's right. And they'll get whatever they want from you, because I can tell you right now, I'd give them everything I have, right?
I would too. I'd say, what, you can have it.
Yep. But and this goes back to, it's interesting you mentioned that, because really when you get into it, and again, this is where the core vision of Beyond Identity came, attacking the identity space, because we've moved remote and everybody's gone to this SaaS. I forget the stats. It's something like the average SMB has like 150 SaaS apps or something like that.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Call it app SaaS apocalypse, whatever you want to call it. But at the end of the day, what we've done is that identity space has gone from private to public. That's number one, because we're moving.
Yep.
And it's created a federated kind of substrate, a federated layer of identity. And so now that federated layer is a completely new attack vector that has both problems with penetration, meaning initial access, and is really, really easy to laterally move. And it's also become harder to detect. So I'm a long way from me saying this is why any solution, which in particular like ours, has to have a very strong cyber defense kind of point of view, because you can't just do the prevention, which is great. That's what you do to start. But we also have a cyber defense, and that means you have to have behavioral analytics at the top. Not only do you have to enable like your system can be plugged into the big brains, because you're not always the big brains. There's some other software that a company has, whether it's an ITDR, a SIM, a SOAR, whatever. We have to be a what I call a good partner, provide the APIs to enable them. But at the same time, we have to have sophisticated behavioral analytics to detect that movement. So in the case where someone steals a credential, or they're traveling in an unknown spot, or they're trying to log in at a weird time, whatever, it can layer on an additional device. Or what we're moving towards very quickly is maybe it's suspicious enough that it requires an authorization from someone else.
Great. And in this entire process, you guys have created the tech to actually identify each individual hardware device and guarantee that that is the right hardware device that this authentication is coming from.
Yeah. And
that's not based on the device manufacturer. So it's independent of Apple, Samsung.
That's right.
Whatever.
Now, there is something interesting there, because there is hardware supply chain, and we're moving towards this very quickly. So and this goes back to secure enclaves, and it depends on the system, or a TPM, when we have the capability that when we install a strong device credential, which fundamentally, when you think about it, if you're going to authenticate, the device needs to be natively part of that authentication, right? I mean,
yes,
it just makes sense that your user credential and that device credential to work in tandem to give you access. And you should use all that information to determine what your policy does with you. So that makes perfect sense. But once you do that, and you start installing these credentials in the TPM or the secure enclave, you can now start doing some hardware supply chain management, which means you can't trace it all the way back. Down the road, you can't trace it all the way back to the PK and the EK, where the EK came from the original manufacturer of the TPM that got jammed onto the platform. And you can track it back to the IT group that provisioned it and said, this is a valid device. So we're getting very close as an industry where there's going to be no excuse for not tracking the entire life cycle of what you have with who you are through the entire kind of device, access, secure collaboration.
I mean, just hearing you describe that, part of me thinks is, do you have an expansion plan to also become an asset management or identifier company? Because you guys certainly have access to all that data at that point. Then that's verified, actually.
Yes. So we have and like every startup, and I'll be perfectly frank with you, it's all about focus and timing, right? Yeah. When at the core, and this goes back to our CEO, who was our previous CTO, and the founding team, Mike Clark, Nelson Mello, brilliant people that had a vision for this company. And we're still trying to chase that vision. And part of that vision does absolutely include the device. In fact, I won't go into their story, but that's kind of where they came from, and said we should make this available for everyone. But we do have an offering called Device 360 that comes out, and we're not trying to be an asset management solution, but there's a certain amount of asset management you need to, so that you can actually deal with the threats and the intelligence tied around the identity.
And Bob, from an affordability perspective, are you guys geared very much towards the enterprise, or like how can Main Street USA avail themselves of your technology, or it's really not intended?
No, it's for everyone. So, and that's one of the things, one of our taglines is secure by design, simple to use, and simple to admin. So we have Fortune 50 customers, and we also have customers that are small to medium-sized businesses, all the way from 10,000 all the way up to millions. We don't really care. Our solution is designed to support both those markets. Now, it's been a challenge for the startup, because the big guys pull us in one direction towards operational excellence, and small guys just want something to work. And we're navigating that. but it's a good problem to have because we have pull in both directions. And we've just gotten FedRamped in the last February. End of February, we got a FedRAMP moderate certification. Shortly after, within 6 weeks of that, we had our first customer on our FedRAMP solution, GovCloud, and we're getting a lot of traction over there because a lot of the FedRAMP initiatives, strategic initiatives, whether that's workforce enablement, which is make it simple, right? Whether it's cyber defense initiatives, which is defend, forward, and disrupt, threat-informed defense, whatever, and there's ETA initiatives just naturally fit into what we're doing.
I tell you, I mean, it sounds like you guys are going to have great success, which means that you guys are probably going to have a great exit. And that's good for you guys, but for all of us on the other side that want to consume the product, you don't want to lose the visionaries that actually built the thing, right? And that gets gobbled up into it's a selfish comment, it's we all do this. We all do the startup for the exit, right? For two reasons. And for me, my history has always been, don't get me wrong, I'm motivated by, the exit and the money and all that. We all are, but it's really been, and I have to say that our CEO is the same way. It's about changing the world we live in and getting the team that can help us do that. So we're 100% confident that everybody at this company is going to have a great exit, and we're going to change the world we live in and change for the better for our customers. And when that happens, we'll go build another one. That's entrepreneurship, but that's another topic in itself, which we can discuss because we've had a whole bunch of those on there. That's an animal of its own making, if you will. Well, Bob, we're at the hour here. I wanted to give you a couple minutes to plug whatever you'd like to, and whatever you want our audience to know about. Go ahead, selflessly promote. Please let us know where you'll be.
Yes, so you're going to find us at beyondidentity.com, one word, beyondidentity.com. You can find us on YouTube. If you look for Beyond Identity, you see we have the best marketing team on the planet. So you'll see a lot of great videos there, and I'm helping that out. You'll also see us at Black Hat. Please come to Black Hat and reach out to anybody at Beyond Identity if you want any. We have the best sales team in the world, run by Mark Preby. He does a great job, and we just reach out to us. We can do a POC or POV in days. We have a next generation solution that's been built from the ground up to address the identity threat landscape as it stands today, not the way it was 5 years ago.
Very cool. Are you guys presenting at Black Hat, Bob?
We're working through those details. We probably will, but I don't have those details yet. We should. Okay. And then, are you going to be there?
We might. Okay. We have been in years past, and then we took a little bit of a break. But okay. We like to do it when we have something that we can present and talk about.
Yes.
And really share with it's a good group of people, and it's a fun conference. But it's undecided as of right now. Okay. On our side.
I get that. I have to say that I'm completely aligned around with your team's mission. I think it's great, and the work that your team does is awesome.
Thank you, Bob. Really appreciate it. You're kind, and you're always welcome back here whenever you want to discuss something. Let us know. We'd be happy to get it out to the audience. And if you're going to be at Black Hat, let us know that too, and we'll put it out on our feeds as well.
Great. And you have a great day.
You too, Bob. Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation.